Hey guys, I'm Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This channel is all about mental health and relationships and attachment and trauma and childhood trauma. And I hope you will consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. Also, I am still getting my groove on TikTok, but I will be posting more and more videos around mental health topics in general with some tools and tips. So be patient there. I'm reworking my TikTok channel, but we'll be posting that very soon. Really, the goal is just to provide resources and information, because I often think that if I had had access to this kind of information as a young person, honestly, or even just, halfway through my life, it would have changed all of my relationships, the choices I made, the ways I engaged, how I dealt with conflict and confrontation, and certainly things like self-care and boundaries. So if you struggle with those things, this is a great channel for you. And I hope you will just consider, sharing your thoughts and feedback at any time. I truly do value each and every one of you and your feedback and thoughts, and I do take them to heart. So today's video is really about what it's like to be an empath, which is like if you're a highly sensitive person, you're here, and an empath is up here. So HSPs are all of these things, including up to the empath level, and how all of that affects our relationships with parents, especially with parents who may have some form of a personality disorder, like borderline, like narcissism, anything that really is sort of a characterological deep difficulty for the parent, how that's going to affect us when we are really born into this world more sensitive. And I also think those who come from traumatic childhoods have to develop the more sensitive parts of us to always be hypervigilant, to protect ourselves. And, the studies do show that even shyness is an inherited trait. And so oftentimes we are, as I say, as empaths and HSPs, we have a very thin membrane between us and the rest of the world. And so if you think about that, if you came out of the womb more sensitive to everything neurologically, sight, smell, taste, sound, everything, you are going to be more impacted by a parent who struggles with things like emotional regulation or mirroring and seeing you, or validation or empathy. It's going to be even more difficult for you. And so that is what today's video is about. So I'm going to go through sort of what it looks like to be an HSP, and then include that into being an empath, some of the challenges we face in that regard. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of all of that with a, BPD, narcissistic parent, something in that regard, who really struggles to really attune to us, okay? So when we think about HSPs, as I'm saying, they're often very sensitive to the world, right? To sight, sound, taste, smell. These are the people that often have misophonia. That's that thing where you cannot stand the sound of someone chewing, and you literally go from 0 to rage. Unfortunately, in my home, we have that one. I very much get that one, but it truly is a neurological disorder, right? And so same thing with being sensitive. So we have that issue. We also have a sensitivity to, other people's emotions, and it can take those of us with HSPs longer, time to wind down after work and get calm. People with HSP tend to love nature and sort of that, general peacefulness of the world. Now, empaths have all of these, but also, the idea is that empaths have a connection to energy, and that energy can go into everything in the world, really, or outside of the world. And so that sort of, the way we vibrate with the world is very intense. We feel it in our bodies and our souls and our minds. It's everywhere. So we're really good at picking up nonverbal communication and reading others, because we are reading the energy. So if you're looking at me and saying, I'm fine, but you're not fine, and I'm more empathically, driven, I'm really going to read that. But as a kid, your face is going to say one thing, your energy is going to say something else, and that is going to prove to be very confusing for us, not just for those who are sensitive, but for really everybody, but in general. So as a result of all of that energy reading, we often internalize other people's feelings, their engagement. We take it on in a very, very deep way. And as a result of that, we can have a difficult time sometimes distinguishing between their emotions and feelings and and behaviors and our own, because that membrane is so thin, there's not a really good barrier sometimes. And another video I'll make will be about how to protect yourself as an empath, what you can do. I've had many patients I've referred to read a book about empaths, and it's been life-changing for them to realize that I'm not crazy, I really am this sensitive, and certain things I can do in the world can help. But I digress, we'll come back to that, okay? So keep that in mind, that barrier is so thin. So in terms of how empaths are affected, their health can be affected. They can be more susceptible to addiction. Certainly relationships and love and sex and intimacy can all be affected by this intense emotional sort of deepness that we feel. Areas like parenting and work, even having perceptual abilities that can make it difficult for us to protect ourselves. So some of the common challenges to walking around the world with this deep energetic connection to self and others is that we can often be easily overstimulated, right? Because we're taking in all of our senses, we're picking everything up. Everything feels like it's at volume 100 when it might just be at 20 or 30. And so we often get overloaded from a sensory perspective. And so taking quiet time and ways to sort of transition are really important. But overstimulation is very common for us. The next thing we often do is we absorb other people's stress and energy levels, right? So if they're super negative, if they're stressed out and unhappy, we're going to take that on. And as a child, it's going to be really difficult to differentiate between, well, what belongs to me and what belongs to my parent. And all of that high level of stress and negativity often makes us hypervigilant, trying to prevent ourselves from having to deal with it and to protect ourselves. So that can often result this, taking on other people's negativity and stress and anxiety symptoms and difficulties in that regard. The next issue we have is feeling things so intensely that the emotional overload that creates can make it difficult sometimes, because we can be really impacted by violence or scary movies or experiences, and so we have to protect ourselves. But if you've had a childhood filled with lots of chaos and trauma and loud noises and screaming and yelling and fighting, those emotions of that parent might have gotten sorted out, but you might still be carrying them for years and years afterwards. Feeling emotional hangovers and just being exhausted from people, oftentimes we see introversion with this as well. It's very common, and so that can be difficult. And certainly the idea about being alone and feeling lonely can be an issue. Many times we need that isolation, that way to sort of regulate ourselves, but it's not always easy to get in certain times of life and relationships. And so that can have, a pretty big weight for us when we need to have that regulation and we don't get it. We also often struggle with emotional burnout, and that's because people tend to want to tell us stuff. I would say a lot of therapists are empaths. And so it's just this natural thing where most of us, even as kids, will tell you that we were just that person, right? People just told us stuff. And it's a wonderful quality to have, but it still needs boundaries and protection. And so in childhood, because we're so inclined to take on that emotionality with a parent who struggles with emotional regulation, that's going to have lingering effects upon us, because everything is going to feel such a high level of emotion when our early attachment years were defined by intense emotionality. And obviously things like our sensitivity to smells and lights and sounds can be very difficult for us and also distressing for others. And so if you had a parent who burned things a lot, right, and you're sensitive to smell, many of us have very heightened senses, especially to things like smell or light. We like the lights dim. Those of us who have this tend to like no bright lights. We're like the worst about office lighting, and most therapists have lamps, so that works out well for us. But in general, I would say that, we have these overdeveloped senses that can be stressful for people. Like I was mentioning before about having misophonia and, not being able to tolerate the sound of people chewing. And oftentimes it creates truly rage, just like that neurologically. And so it can be difficult for us and other people. So if a parent was really insensitive to that, that's going to be difficult for us too. And lastly, expressing our needs and boundaries in intimate relationships is going to be really important because we are so easily triggered. We do need our space, and expressing that can be difficult if you weren't raised to have boundaries or have your boundaries respected. So let's talk about what happens when you have been raised by a parent who struggles with BPD or NPD or some form of disorder where they really can't attune to you, where they are triggered emotionally, where they are perhaps insensitive to your sensitivities. And I wouldn't be surprised if many borderlines, I have no research on this, but also had empath qualities because they have that heightened sensitivity. And so it would make sense that combination could also be really difficult for them. So we're going to have the issue first and foremost of taking on this parent's emotions. And because those who struggle with some form of disorder, whether they are unable to mirror back to you, like in narcissism, and it's just about them and you're an extension of them, or they're borderline, let's say, and they are, all over the map emotionally, all of that is going to be like a tidal wave for us at all times that we're just trying to balance, to protect ourselves from. And that can be incredibly difficult and contribute to that sort of development of the inner critic, where you're trying to protect yourself, and yet you're also shaming yourself because of this need to be perfect and the constant failure at that. But that all revolves around trying to keep our empath self protected and safe and not in trouble or not triggered, which is impossible with a parent who, especially an untreated parent who struggles. Oftentimes we also have a hard time differentiating between, as I was saying, their emotions and ours. And so we might see some traits of borderline in ourselves if our parents have this issue, right? That high sensitivity to rejection. There's no, surprise we might take that on and at times not be able to differentiate, well, how much of that really belongs to me and how much of that did I internalize from my parent? As a result of this, I think because those who have more complex childhoods, certainly more parents with borderline, for example, because we know the lifetime risk for psychiatric issues is high. That includes health issues, all of that chronic, issues around, things like fibromyalgia and rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and chronic diabetes and cancer and heart disease. All of that stuff means our health risk is going to be higher as a result, even if we're not empaths. So imagine how much higher you might be and how much more susceptible you might be to illness, to chronic illness especially, if you had a parent who constantly violated your boundaries, who was constantly loud, like I said, or doing things that triggered you, that as a child you could not protect yourself against. Even things like addictions might also be an issue. Not only might the parent who struggles have addictions, it might also increase our risk because we're trying to find ways to deal with the sensory overload, to numb out from the emotional overload. And so all of those risks are honestly going to be higher, I believe, when we have this just general, I keep saying, thin membrane between us and the rest of the world. And then the last few things are that because of the tendency to repeat the patterns in our childhood and to unconsciously choose caregivers who resemble our parents, even though in the beginning we swear up and down we're not doing that and they're so different, oftentimes in our efforts to heal the wounds of childhood, we unconsciously choose partners who repeat them and trigger them. And so that repetition compulsion is so much more likely for us if we have that wound. And so those who are empaths tend to repeat those patterns more because they're taking on so much of that wounding and oftentimes not able to separate what belongs to them and their parent. And lastly, we're more inclined to be drained and exhausted and overwhelmed. And if you had a parent who, like I'm saying, was constantly changing marriages, let's say, or partners, you had different step parents or siblings that were step siblings, who also added to the noise, the level, the chaos in your home. Certainly only children oftentimes as empaths, because they didn't really have that, other factors of other kids to deal with, really struggle in their adult lives if they have a bunch of kids, or they work in a loud office, or they have loud neighbors, right? That regulation, it was always a little under their control as only children, even with a difficult parent, but it really goes offline with extensively loud, chaotic environments. And all of that is so deeply depleting for us because of that. So you take all of those issues of being born with, I think there are beautiful qualities of being an empath, but what happens when we are, growing up in these environments, let's say where the parent was, typical let's say BPD at times, the source of safety was also the source of fear, right? In any child, that's going to create hypervigilance and perfectionism and relational difficulties and a lack of safety and attunement. But it is even going to take it to another level when we've come out of the womb this way. So I would highly encourage you to explore ways to protect yourself. If you are an empath and you have a borderline or narcissistic parent and they're still in your life, it's really important to do the work on setting boundaries, on protecting yourself, on reducing engagements if you're going to be around them, on looking at how you set up your day. How do you engage with your kids or your spouse or your boss? Trying to find times of peace and quiet, doing mindful activities, ways to really just give yourself time to process and breathe. It's really, really important. And also to consider doing the work on healing these childhood wounds, because these, parents who struggle in their own right often leave a lingering trace of wound. It is like a tattoo on our bodies of their wounds, that the more aware of the universe we are, the harder it is to have those scars erased. They become part of us. And I think this is true for every child, regardless of how you come out of the womb with, if you have difficult parents. But it really does, I hope, validate you that you're not crazy. It's not in your head, that these ways of engaging in the world make you a beautiful, deeply connected human, but it can also increase your risk, I really do believe, for mental health issues, chronic health issues, addictions, and things like that. So thanks for watching. Please stay safe and well. Please don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. And I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.